When my husband and I understood that the Lord wanted us to move to Kenya, we were already visiting Kenya about 5 times a year, delivering Christian leadership seminars at weekends, and my husband doing his leadership and management consulting during the week. When we started assessing where we would live, we absolutely did not want to live in Nairobi City, and we seemingly stumbled across a ministry called Care of Creation, which was all about planting indigenous trees, and an associated ministry called Farming God's Way, and they were within commuting distance to Nairobi. I say we seemingly stumbled across them, but in fact it was all an orchestrated part of Father God's grand plan for us. So we moved within walking distance of this ministry, and we learned all about Farming God's Way. We have an interest in these kinds of things because we studied biology and some pathology and ecology in our degrees, as well as the social sciences I told you about earlier. So since student days, we've had a very keen interest in health, in healthy eating and healthy lifestyle, and in balanced ecology and correct, healthy environment. And none of this diminished one bit on becoming born again, but rather it increased in relevance and importance to us. And then, when we learned what we learned on the Farming God's Way course, not only did our interest in environmental correctness jump up another huge level, but our understanding of Father God and His ways took a quantum leap as well. Yes, learning about Farming God's Way caused in us a quantum leap in understanding Father God in general. So perhaps a bit surprising, but let me do my best to explain. Farming God's Way is an offshoot of the parent ministry Foundations for Farming, and both ministries belong to Africa. There is another ministry in America that teaches the same things, called Back to Eden. And how we came across that ministry was another amazingly orchestrated event that we can only possibly call a God incidence, never a mere coincidence. Both the founder of Foundations for Farming and the founder of Back to Eden recognized what they recognized due to serious prayer. Both were struggling with water issues, soil issues, and poor yields, and both of them decided to go to God for answers and help. Both of them, continents apart, heard the same answers from Father God. They both believed there had to be better ways to farm, and ways for farmers, both big and small, to flourish, but both were having major problems in doing so. They both cried out to God for help and wisdom, for themselves, but also in general, and both of them heard exactly the same answer. Both of them put the answer into practice, seriously and long term, and both of them witnessed the most amazing levels of abundance as a result. Both of them discovered that what's commonly held to be agricultural wisdom and technology and practice is devastatingly bad for water conservation and soil quality and thus yields. And both of them discovered that there is a godly way to farm and grow crops that produces vastly greater yields. So both men were struggling to get anything like adequate yields. Both men were praying, asking God for inspiration, and Father God said to both of them, "Look in the forests around about you and see how I do my plant growing." Over time, both men came to recognize that Father God was saying, "The way I get plants to continuously flourish, and the way I get new young plants to flourish, is by never baring the soil, and never turning soil over, but keeping soil continuously covered with layers and layers of rotting and composting dead material. I am returning nutrients to the soil all the time. Thus, I am sowing into plant growth abundantly and constantly. And I am conserving water in the soil all the time. I am being a wise steward of water. And there is a hugely complex microhabitat of slugs and bugs and bacteria and fungi, all composting and all holding correct soil structure together all the time. Whereas man has decided, in his wisdom, to bare soil completely, and thus have no constantly returning compost and full range of minerals, and no water conservation method, and man has decided to plough the soil and turn it over and harrow it, and thus destroy the soil structure and all the microbiology going on in the soil. Well, without going into any more farming detail here, because you could visit any of these websites if you wanted to know more, but the huge points I want to make are as follows. Man and science and technology lead us to believe that deep ploughing and thorough harrowing of a thoroughly bared field, plus scientifically measured use of chemical fertilizers, is the obvious and the only knowledgeable and technological way to proceed for farming crops. God showed these two men that is precisely opposite and opposed to his way for keeping wet soil, rich soil, and producing hugely more abundant yields. The Foundations for Farming founder in Zimbabwe went on and used these zero-tillage and mulch methods in a 3,500-hectare farm, and produced record crops for the area again and again and again, and is now teaching the methods all over the world. The Back to Eden founder used the godly zero-tillage and mulching methods to feed his 7-person family superabundantly, constantly and entirely, and now has people from all over the world watching his Vimeo film online and visiting his garden for teaching tours. The Farming God's Way ministry specializes in teaching subsistence farmers all over Africa and is able to redeem acreage that was producing the likes of 3 50 kg bags of maize per acre, and after 3 and 4 years of correct mulching, that land is producing the likes of 60 and 70 50 kg bags per acre. This is all quite simply a demonstration of mighty levels of abundance when things are done God's way. Well, this sets my mind reeling about all sorts of things. What about all the desperately hungry people all over various African countries? What about all the huge sums of money spent on hiring tractors, ploughing and buying chemical fertilizer? And then all the pathetic hunger-producing and poverty-producing yields that result? What about all the soil erosion happening all over African nations? What about all the runoff that occurs when it does rain? And all that rain that does not get deep in the soil and does not get kept in the soil when the baking sun comes out, and does not return into underground watercourses, and all the flash flooding that causes property loss and even loss of life. All because people are not farming God's way at all. So the crop yield difference between man's conventional farming and zero-tillage and mulch farming are huge. And the list of downstream consequences of not farming God's way is a very long list as well. Because people get yields like 3 bags of maize per acre, they plant and grow only maize, just to get just enough for their family for the year. What if they were getting 50 bags per acre? But they don't need 50 bags, so they could give over half the acre, or even 3/4 of each field or acre, to other crops. Then they could increase the different nutrients they are feeding themselves and their family. Then they would be far, far healthier than if they are almost solely eating maize. Then, not only do they have diversity of nutrients in their diet and save loads of money on medical bills and medicines, they also provide diversity of crop as habitat for bugs and tiny creatures, and then birds and small mammals, and on throughout the ecology of the whole place. These things are not insignificant. These things are major. These things are all about human health, which is a billion-dollar issue in every country in the world, whether due to excess and indulgent lifestyles and poverty of wisdom and restraint, or due to lack and hunger and financial and nutritional poverty. These things are also all about the environment, another billion-dollar and disastrous issue all over the world these days, with imbalances of all different sorts all over the place, but always all due to man not using and stewarding the environment according to God's original intentions and ways. Man's university-taught and industry-funded ways for agriculture are disastrously wrong. They cause massive, massive hunger and illness. They cause massive, massive poverty. They cause massive destruction of the environment. They are not the right stewardship way to utilize land and grow food. This in turn even leads to things like weather pattern changes, people migrations, desertification, and encroachment into areas that could and should be left for wildlife. If 1 acre can produce 50 bags of crop instead of 3, but currently it is typically only producing 3, yet a family needs, say, 30 bags of crop, then they need to plant up 10 acres. Or they need aid food from somewhere else, so somewhere else more acres have to be used for producing crops. So acres and acres and acres of extra land is having to be used for poor yields, whereas every family could be more than adequately fed by far less acres. So what about all the talk these days about food scarcity? What about all the talk about food security? What about all the issues of need for land, expense of land, and forever encroaching into virgin wild land, when in fact nowhere near as much land would be needed if only God's methods for food production were being used? And in some areas, how much war and fighting could also be avoided. I was bowled over when I learned about all of this. I was bowled over by Father God's levels of abundance relative to man's totally incorrect, destructive, and unhealthy ways. I was horrified to think of all the hunger and starvation that need not be occurring, and I was horrified at all the land destruction that need not be happening. And I was bowled over at how hugely better all these things could be if only people would turn to God for His ways and turn wholly away from man's ways and worldly ways. Again, the difference in yields between the worldly conventional way for farming and the godly way for farming is absolutely enormous, And thus all these issues and related subjects could all be hugely improved if only people would be searching for the truth instead of accepting worldly lies and ways. And it only takes someone like me a short while to then be thinking, I wonder what other worldly ways we are all accepting that are just as drastically wrong as this area of farming and crop growing. Oh boy! Well, I already know that there are quite a few. Just before finishing this week, though, I want to ensure that you leave this subject on a huge, big, positive note, and not on any negative or pessimistic note. Godly growth and progress usher out of positive faith, not negative fear or depression. The biggest message that I got out of hearing about farming God's way is the following. Father God has provided for abundant food for all people throughout all history. His ways of stewarding creation have always been able to provide superabundantly for all people at all times. The only reason there is ever any lack is when man does not consistently and wisely seek for and then employ God's ways. This is massive revelation and understanding. Our loving, heavenly, perfect, all-wise Daddy Father God has never, ever been responsible for one hungry soul throughout the whole of history. Our loving, heavenly Daddy Father God has instead provided ways to seek Him for and then put into practice, which will always produce superabundantly. Our Father God is a superabundantly providing, prayer answering, leading into all truth God. This is correctly appreciating Father God's nature. And this is what to meditate upon and believe. And then, what we believe, we will produce from our lives. Hence my desire to help us all see Father God as He really is. Because how we see and imagine Him will become what we reproduce in our lives. And so how much effort we put into understanding Him correctly and discerning Him correctly is paramount.